The hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the faint scent of freshly baked bread were the only constants in Evelyn's world on Thursday evenings. Grocery shopping wasn't just a chore, it was a ritual, a quiet punctuation to the solitude that defined her life. She had long accepted the predictability of her days. The mornings spent tidying her small home, afternoons with novels that never quite held her attention, and evenings like this, weaving through the aisles, crossing off items from her neatly written list. At 52, Evelyn's life was a tapestry of stillness, stitched together by years of compromise and missed opportunities. Her marriage of 27 years had ended amicably, but left her with a silence she hadn't yet learned to fill. Friends had drifted, children had grown, and she'd settled into an existence she often described as comfortable, though deep down, she wasn't sure if it was comfort or resignation. On this particular evening, her list was shorter than usual. She reached for a box of tea on the top shelf, stretching on her toes but falling just short. Before she could contemplate climbing onto the lower shelf, a dangerous but not uncommon solution, an arm appeared beside her, effortlessly retrieving the box. "Here you go," a warm, rich voice said. Startled, she turned to see a man, perhaps in his late 20s or early 30s, smiling at her. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his green eyes sparkled with an easy kindness that took her breath away. He held the box of tea out to her, his grin both playful and sincere. "Oh, thank you," she managed, feeling an uncharacteristic blush rise to her cheeks. She rarely blushed anymore. What was there to blush about in a life so uneventful? "No problem," he replied, stepping back but not leaving the aisle. "Tall shelves can be cruel." She chuckled despite herself, clutching the box like a lifeline. Cruel indeed. They seem to grow taller every year. He laughed, a sound that filled the space between them, disarming and genuine. "I think that's gravity's fault, not the shelves." The exchange was brief, barely lasting a minute, but Evelyn felt an unfamiliar warmth as she watched him walk away, a loaf of bread tucked under his arm. She shook her head, chiding herself for the flutter in her chest. He was just a kind stranger, and she was being ridiculous. But as she finished her shopping and headed to the checkout, she found herself scanning the aisles, wondering if she might catch another glimpse of him. By the time she returned to her car, her predictable Thursday evening felt slightly less predictable. Driving home, Evelyn couldn't help but replay the moment in her mind, lingering on the way his eyes had met hers, the way his laughter had lingered in the air. It wasn't much, just a spark, but after years of dimness, even a spark could feel like a flame. For the first time in a long while, she smiled as she unloaded her groceries, a tiny flicker of something unfamiliar stirring in her heart. The following week, Evelyn returned to the grocery store at the same time, partly out of habit and partly, though she wouldn't admit it to herself, hoping to see him again. She shook off the thought as silly. People didn't cross paths like that twice in a city this size. Still, when she found herself in the tea aisle, she glanced at the shelves a little longer than necessary, her heart sinking when they remained devoid of green-eyed strangers. Her cart was half filled when she turned into the produce section and saw him, carefully selecting apples and placing them into a reusable bag. For a moment she froze. Then, scolding herself for her hesitation, she pushed her cart forward. "Apple season already?" she asked, surprising herself with the boldness of initiating conversation. He looked up, his face breaking into the same warm smile that had stayed with her all week. "It is, though I think the good ones are still a few weeks away." He gestured toward the fruit in his hand. "These will do for now." Granny Smith fan. "Not particularly," she admitted, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "I'm more of a gala person. Sweet, mild. Safe, I suppose." "Safe is good," he said, shrugging. "But sometimes a little tartness makes things interesting." The conversation felt easy, like a dance she hadn't rehearsed but somehow knew the steps to. Before long, they were walking through the aisles together, discussing everything from their favorite cuisines to the curious quirks of the store's layout. His name was Ben, she learned, and he worked as a freelance graphic designer. She told him about her part-time job at the local library and her love of books, to which he responded with genuine interest, asking for recommendations. "Have you read A Man Called Ove?" she asked as they neared the checkout. "I haven't, but I've heard it's good. Should I?" She nodded. "It's about finding connection in unexpected places." I think you'd like it. Ben laughed lightly. Sounds like fate then. She wasn't sure if he meant the book or their meeting, but either way, the comment sent a pleasant warmth through her. By the time they said goodbye, Evelyn's cheeks were flushed, and her heart felt lighter than it had in years. As she walked to her car, she couldn't stop smiling. It wasn't just his charm or the way he'd listened so attentively. It was the joy of being truly seen, of having someone look at her, not through her as if she mattered. Later that evening, she found herself wishing she had said more, shared more, even though it had been so long since anyone had shown interest in the small, quiet details of her life. Their interaction might have ended there, a pleasant coincidence in the vast unpredictability of the world. But it didn't. The following week, Ben was there again, and this time he greeted her first. Over time, these meetings became a kind of tradition, each one filling Evelyn's days with a little more brightness. He was younger, decades younger, but the difference in their ages seemed to dissolve in the shared laughter, the inside jokes, and the growing sense of familiarity. Evelyn found herself looking forward to Thursdays in a way she hadn't looked forward to anything in years. Their conversations began to stray beyond groceries. Ben told her about his projects, his dream of opening a design studio, and his family back in Colorado. Evelyn spoke of her children, now scattered across the country, and the garden she tended in her small backyard. One day, as they stood in line together, Ben asked, "Do you always shop on Thursdays? Or is it just the universe helping us cross paths?" Evelyn hesitated, unsure how to answer without revealing how much she had begun to treasure these moments. "Maybe a bit of both," she replied, her voice soft but her smile unmistakably bright. That evening, as she sat in her favorite chair with a cup of tea, Evelyn realized how much Ben had become a part of her life. He was no longer just a friendly face at the store. He was something more, a reminder that joy could sneak into even the most routine corners of life, and that, sometimes, sweetness could indeed be found in something unexpected. Evelyn wasn't sure when her feelings began to change. It wasn't a single moment or grand revelation, but a slow and steady shift, like the turning of the seasons. One day, she was a woman exchanging pleasant conversations with a charming younger man. The next, she caught herself thinking about him at odd hours, wondering what he was doing, how he was feeling, whether he thought about her too. At first, she brushed it off. "Don't be ridiculous," she muttered to herself one morning, staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her face, though kind, bore the lines of time, her hair dusted with gray. She was a woman in her 50s, long past the age of impetuous romance. Whatever she felt for Ben, she told herself, was nothing more than gratitude for his attention. But the heart is not so easily fooled. The next time she saw him, her pulse quickened at the sight of him strolling through the aisles. He wore a navy sweater that made his green eyes stand out even more vividly, and his easy smile sent a flutter through her chest that she hadn't felt in years. They spent nearly an hour together that day, chatting about everything and nothing. He told her about a hiking trip he was planning, and she shared her favorite trails from when her children were young. He laughed at her stories, his laughter warm and genuine, and when he reached over to steady her cart as it wobbled, his hand brushed hers ever so slightly. The contact lingered in her mind long after he was gone. That evening, Evelyn found herself sitting in her garden, watching the sunset with a glass of wine in hand. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of autumn leaves, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were consumed by him, his laugh, his kindness, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. And then it hit her. This wasn't just friendship. The realization came like a jolt, both exhilarating and terrifying. She cared for Ben in a way that went far beyond the bounds of casual acquaintanceship. Her feelings had crept up on her, unbidden and unstoppable, like a vine growing through cracks in the pavement. For a moment, she let herself sit with it. She allowed herself to feel the warmth, the giddiness, the sheer possibility of it. But just as quickly, the doubts came rushing in. He was young, too young. What would he think if he knew? What would others think? The fear of judgment was paralyzing. The thought of people whispering behind her back, of her children finding out and disapproving, of Ben himself being horrified by her feelings, made her chest tighten. "Stop it," she told herself firmly, standing up and brushing off her jeans. "It's nothing. Just a passing crush." But deep down she knew better. Over the next few days, her emotions waged a silent war. On one hand, she felt foolish and embarrassed. On the other, she felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. Ben had stirred something in her that she thought had long since faded, a sense of possibility, of being truly seen, of being more than just a shadow in the background of her own life. One evening, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a thought crossed her mind that she couldn't shake. What if this isn't just a passing crush? What if this is something worth exploring? The thought was terrifying, but it was also electrifying. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt like the world wasn't quite as small and predictable as she had believed. And though she didn't yet know what to do with these feelings, one thing was certain. They weren't going away. Evelyn woke the next morning with a knot in her stomach. The quiet hum of her predictable life felt heavier now, burdened by the knowledge of her feelings. She busied herself with chores, cleaning, organizing, and baking cookies she didn't need, but no task could distract her for long. She replayed every moment she'd shared with Ben in her mind. She thought of his laughter, his kindness, the way he always seemed to look at her like she was someone worth listening to. It wasn't just the surface of him that drew her in. It was the way he made her feel like she mattered. Yet, every warm thought was quickly shadowed by doubt. He probably doesn't see you like that. The voice in her head was sharp and unrelenting. Why would he? He's young, vibrant, with his whole life ahead of him. What could he possibly want from someone like you? The next time she saw him, she resolved to push her feelings aside. She would go back to being friendly and nothing more. She had spent a lifetime learning how to bury inconvenient emotions, and she told herself this would be no different. But life rarely goes according to plan. She saw Ben in the produce section, crouched over a display of apples. His face lit up when he saw her, and before she knew it, he was walking toward her, his arms filled with produce and that ever-present easy smile. "You're just the person I was hoping to run into," he said, his tone warm and genuine. "Oh?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, her heart thudding in her chest. "I need your opinion," he said, holding up a few apples. "I'm making an apple pie for my sister's birthday, and I have no idea which ones to use. You seem like someone who knows her way around a kitchen." The compliment caught her off guard. She smiled despite herself and reached out to inspect the apples. As she weighed them in her hands, their conversation flowed effortlessly. She told him about her late mother's apple pie recipe, and he shared a story about a baking disaster from his college days. They moved from apples to baking tips to life stories, their conversation stretching far longer than either had planned. Evelyn was acutely aware of the way he leaned in when she spoke, the way his eyes never seemed to stray from hers. For a brief, fleeting moment, she allowed herself to wonder. Could he feel something too? But the thought was quickly drowned out by the wave of self-doubt that followed. As much as she enjoyed their conversations, she couldn't silence the little voice in her head that whispered cruel truths about her age, her wrinkles, her place in the world. That evening, as she sat in her living room, the weight of it all came crashing down. She felt foolish for even entertaining the idea that he could see her as anything more than a kind acquaintance. And yet, she couldn't deny the way her heart felt lighter when he was around, or the way her loneliness seemed to fade when he smiled at her. She stared at her reflection in the window, the faint lines on her face illuminated by the glow of the streetlights outside. "You're not that woman," she whispered to herself. "You don't take risks. You don't chase impossible dreams." But as much as she tried to convince herself, a small, persistent voice deep inside her pushed back. "What if you're wrong? What if this is your chance?" The conflict raged on, her head and heart locked in a battle neither could win. She wanted to be practical, to let go of something she believed could only end in heartbreak. But the hope, no matter how small, refused to die. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt caught between fear and possibility. And though the path ahead felt uncertain, she couldn't shake the feeling that this connection, however unexpected, had already begun to change her. The idea had been forming in Evelyn's mind for days, simmering in the quiet moments between her doubts and hopes. Every time she saw Ben, it grew a little stronger, a little harder to dismiss. It was a simple thing, really, an invitation to dinner. But the thought of asking him made her palms sweat and her breath hitch. She rehearsed it in her head 100 different ways. "I was thinking about making dinner and thought you might like to join. I could use some help with my mother's old apple pie recipe. What do you think? Would you like to come over sometime?" No pressure, of course, But each time she imagined saying it, she also pictured his face shifting into discomfort or polite rejection. She hated how much she cared about what he might think, how deeply the possibility of rejection stung even before it happened. By the end of the week, Evelyn decided she had to stop overthinking it. She would never know what could happen unless she took the step. At worst, he would say no, and she could retreat back into the safety of her solitude. That Friday afternoon, she found herself back in the grocery store, her heart pounding as she scanned the aisles for him. She spotted him in the baking section, comparing 2 brands of flour. His presence, so natural and at ease, made her want to turn and leave before he noticed her. But then he looked up and smiled, and her resolve softened into something warmer. "Evelyn," he greeted her, his tone warm and familiar. "Fancy meeting you here again." "Hello, Ben," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. He held up the 2 bags of flour. "Any chance you know which of these is better? I'm trying to make bread this time, and I'm way out of my league." She chuckled softly, stepping closer to inspect them. "Go with the unbleached. It'll give the bread a better texture." He grinned, tossing the bag into his basket. "You're a lifesaver, as always." For a moment, they stood there, talking about bread and recipes, their conversation as easy as ever. But Evelyn knew she couldn't let the moment pass without asking. She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. "Ben," she began, her voice softer than she intended. "I was wondering, would you like to come over for dinner sometime?" His brows lifted slightly in surprise, but his smile didn't waver. "Dinner? Yes," she said quickly, hoping to mask her nervousness. "I've been meaning to try out a new recipe, and I could use a second opinion. You've been so enthusiastic about food, I thought you might enjoy it." He hesitated for only a second before his smile grew wider. "I'd love that. When were you thinking?" Her heart leapt in her chest, the weight of her fears lifting just a little. "How about Sunday evening? Around 6. "Perfect," he said, his tone as warm as his expression. "I'll bring some wine. Any preferences?" "Surprise me," she replied, her voice steadier now, buoyed by his easy acceptance. They parted ways soon after, but Evelyn felt lighter than she had in weeks. As she walked to her car, she couldn't help but smile, her thoughts racing with equal parts excitement and apprehension. Sunday couldn't come soon enough, and while she still wrestled with her doubts, a new feeling had begun to take root: hope. The evening arrived faster than Evelyn had expected, the moments between her invitation and now stretching in her memory like a dream. She spent the day preparing, chopping, stirring, and setting the table, her mind flitting from the mundane tasks to the anticipated arrival of Ben. There was something about the way her heart fluttered in her chest, a quiet nervousness she hadn't felt in years. It was as if this dinner, this simple invitation, held the weight of something far more significant than it appeared. She was pulling a roast from the oven when the doorbell rang, a sound that startled her more than she cared to admit. Evelyn straightened her shoulders, took a final breath, and walked to the door. Ben stood there, his usual easy smile in place, the bottle of wine in his hand, looking almost too formal for a quiet evening at her home. But his presence was comforting, familiar in a way that seemed to draw her in immediately. She noticed the faint glow of candlelight from the dining room, and his eyes widened in approval as he stepped inside. "Wow," he said, his voice low with admiration. "This looks incredible." "Thank you," Evelyn replied, stepping aside to let him in. "I didn't want to overdo it, but I thought a nice dinner would be, well, a good way to spend some time." She immediately regretted the words, the nerves creeping back, but he didn't seem to notice. Ben took a look around, his gaze softening as it swept over the little details: fresh flowers on the table, the warm glow of the candles, and the cozy atmosphere she had intentionally created. "You've made this place feel so inviting," he said quietly, setting the wine down on the counter. She smiled, feeling a slight blush creep up her neck. "It's nothing fancy. I just wanted to make it nice." They sat down at the table, the conversation flowing easily between them. At first, it was about the meal, how she had prepared it, what inspired the dish, and whether he thought she had nailed the recipe. But as the evening unfolded, the conversation drifted into more personal territory. Ben spoke about his childhood, his love for cooking, and even his dreams for the future. Evelyn found herself listening, captivated by his honesty and the openness with which he spoke. She shared more than she had intended to as well. Her thoughts on how she had felt after her divorce, the isolation of the years that followed, and the simple joys of having someone new in her life who made her feel seen, understood. Ben's eyes were full of warmth, his interest genuine, and his laughter was easy, rich with sincerity. By the time they finished the meal and moved to the living room with the wine, Evelyn realized how much she had relaxed. The awkwardness had dissolved, replaced by a sense of ease that was more intimate than she had expected. She caught herself laughing at something he said, and for a moment, she didn't recognize the woman who had come into the evening filled with doubts. As the evening grew late, Ben stood to leave. Evelyn walked him to the door, a quiet moment of hesitation hanging between them. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice rich with appreciation. "This was perfect. I didn't expect," he trailed off, seeming at a loss for words. "You're welcome," she replied, her voice quieter now. She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm glad you came." He smiled, but there was something more in his gaze, an intensity she hadn't seen before. For a second, they just stood there, eyes locked, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The air was charged, and Evelyn couldn't tell if it was the closeness of the evening or something deeper stirring between them. Finally, Ben spoke, his voice a little softer, more serious. "Evelyn, He paused, as if searching for the right words. "I'm glad you invited me. And I don't know how to say this, but I hope this isn't the last time." Her breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening. "Me too," she whispered, her hand lightly brushing against his as she stepped back. Ben hesitated, his eyes searching hers, before he leaned in and placed a gentle kiss on her cheek. It was brief, but it lingered, the warmth of it making her heart race. "Good night," he said, his voice full of meaning. As she closed the door behind him, Evelyn stood there for a moment, her hand still resting on the doorknob. Her heart was thumping, her body alive with a mixture of emotions, exhilaration, confusion, and a growing certainty that this was the beginning of something much more profound than she had anticipated. She didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time in a long while, Evelyn was ready to find out. As the days passed, Evelyn found herself thinking of Ben constantly. There were moments when she would be doing something mundane, folding laundry, making coffee, or sitting at her desk, and his face would appear in her mind unbidden but welcome. She'd think of his laugh, his easy charm, the way he looked at her as though she mattered. It made her smile, even when she was alone. But there was also a quiet war waging in her mind. The age difference, the societal expectations, everything that had once been so clear and simple now seemed so complicated. Evelyn had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to navigate life alone without needing to answer to anyone. But now, as her feelings for Ben deepened, she couldn't help but wonder, how would people perceive them? Would they think she was foolish for falling for someone so much younger? She didn't even know if Ben saw this as more than a fleeting connection. Perhaps to him, it was just a pleasant diversion. He was still in the early stages of his life, full of energy and ambition. She was in the second half of her life, with children grown and a past filled with both joy and sorrow. The fear of judgment gnawed at her. What would people say? Would they understand? And what about Ben? What did he truly want from her? Was he looking for something more, or was he simply enjoying the novelty of spending time with someone older? One afternoon, as she sat in her favorite armchair with a cup of tea, she tried to quiet the swirl of doubts that had been growing in her mind. Instead, she found herself reflecting on what this experience had taught her. This wasn't about age or the superficial constraints that society placed on relationships. This was about connection, about feeling seen and heard in a way she hadn't in years. It was about the excitement of discovering someone new, of rediscovering parts of herself she had buried under the weight of time. The truth was, she had lived a life filled with compromises, with moments of hesitation and regret. She had been a mother, a wife, and a daughter, fulfilling roles that others had expected of her. But in Ben's presence, she didn't feel like she was anyone's second choice or his background character. She felt important. She felt vibrant, desired, not in a way that was superficial, but in a way that made her remember the woman she had been before life became so predictable. Ben wasn't just a younger man. He was someone who had shown her a new perspective, Someone who made her laugh in a way that was so effortless it made her wonder when she had stopped laughing. She had never expected this, had never even thought it was possible at this stage in her life. But here she was, feeling something she hadn't in so long, hope. Evelyn closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the warmth of the tea fill her senses. She was ready to stop running from the feelings that had taken root. She was ready to embrace this connection with Ben for what it was, regardless of the voices in her head or the world outside. Age, after all, was just a number. It was the depth of their bond, the way they understood each other, that mattered. And if it was wrong, if the world couldn't understand, then maybe it was time to stop caring. For the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt a quiet certainty settle within her. She deserved to be happy, to feel this alive. Love, in all its forms, had no expiration date. And so, she decided she would no longer let fear control her. If this was something worth pursuing, then she would pursue it, wholeheartedly. Whatever it became, whatever people thought, she would trust in herself, in what her heart had to say. The day Ben arrived at her door was one she had been anticipating with a mix of excitement and nerves. Evelyn had spent the morning pacing around her house, tidying up here and there, though she knew the place was already comfortable, warm, just the way she liked it. She wondered, briefly, if Ben would feel out of place in her world, a world that had been hers for so long. A world where she was the only one who truly knew its rhythms, its corners, and its quiet spaces. But as the doorbell rang and she opened it to see him standing there, with a shy smile and flowers in hand, all of her doubts seemed to fade. The world outside, the judgments and expectations, no longer mattered. In that moment, it was just the two of them, standing at the threshold of something new. They sat down together, sharing a quiet dinner that felt intimate, even though the conversation was casual and easy. Ben spoke of his work, his dreams, the things he wanted to see and do. Evelyn shared the memories of her own life, the lessons she had learned, the wisdom she had gathered over the years. And as they spoke, it became clear that what they shared was more than just a fleeting connection. It was a meeting of minds and hearts. At some point, they stopped talking. Ben reached out, his hand gently brushing against hers. A simple touch, but one that carried the weight of everything they had both felt over the past few weeks. Evelyn looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't feel the need to hide anything. Her longing, her fear, her joy. She saw in his eyes the same openness, the same vulnerability. The kiss that followed was soft and hesitant, but it held all the promise of something real. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it didn't need to be. It was the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted, but both were willing to embrace. In the quiet that followed, Evelyn allowed herself to reflect on the journey that had led her here. She thought about the years spent alone, the moments of doubt, the years when she had put her own desires aside for the sake of others. She had never imagined that at 52, she would feel so full of life, so eager for more. But here she was with Ben, in this moment that felt like a fresh start. She smiled, looking at him with a tenderness that spoke volumes. Age, they both knew, was no barrier. Love had no timeline, no expiration date. It was not bound by societal expectations or the judgments of others. It was a force that could spark between two people, regardless of how many years separated them. And as they sat together, their hands intertwined, Evelyn understood that love had always been waiting for her, waiting to be rediscovered, not in the past, but in the present. She had lived for so long with the fear that it was too late for her, that she was too old for love, for passion, for connection. But now, with Ben beside her, she knew the truth. It was never too late. No matter how old she was, or what anyone else thought, Evelyn would follow her heart. She would no longer wait for the world to tell her when it was time to love. Love, in all its beautiful and complicated forms, would come when it was meant to. And when it did, she would embrace it fully, without hesitation, without fear. For the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt alive in the truest sense. And that was enough.